I wanted to welcome and thank Susan Murphy, who is out with a new book. We had her on this Pacific Zen Luminaries Speaker Series about a year and a half ago. And she's come out with a new book, a book called A Fire Runs Through All Things. I thought it'd be just a wonderful chance for us to spend some time talking with her and chatting. And so thank you, Susan, for coming in. Thank you, John Tarrant and Allison Atwell. They'll be coming on towards the end to add some questions and comments. And thank you all for coming. We have quite a contingent calling in from Australia, so that's nice to see. Good friends from there. So, Susan, I wanted to start off, I guess, a little bit about this book, about the title, "A Fire Runs Through All Things." What's the story behind the title?
Well, you'll have to ask Jon Tarrant for the very full story of it, but they are words, slightly adjusted words that were inscribed on a kiyosaki. And it was on our altar in Sydney at various points when John was visiting. A fire runs, it's actually in John's version, it's "this fire runs through all things." And so that caught me very strongly when I first picked up the stick and saw those words. Later on, that stick broke, as all good kiyosakus do. And I think it got mended in a wonderfully sort of improvised way. And it still exists. But of course, the fire that runs through all things outlasts all of us. It runs through all of us. And it is not interested in beginnings or ends. So we're safe in its hands. Yep.
And also, I think you mentioned that part of the inspiration, part of your desire to write the book came from the vast fires that burned through Australia in 2019 and 20. I remember pulling up a satellite picture of Australia at that time, and the whole country seemed to be on fire, particularly, the east where you live. And
yeah, indeed. Well, look, you can't go past an event like that without it indenting you very deeply. You know, it came very, very close to devouring it just where I'm sitting, right here. But in the end, that didn't happen. By the grace of a very slight wind change, it didn't happen. But that was a fire that, 6 months, nearly 7 months of continuous fire that the clouds of all those burnt beings and trees and human beings went around the earth 3 times. So everybody has breathed some of those funerary remains. We all shared those fires one way and another. And the ash falling in the ocean caused an algal bloom that was, I forget how big, something like the size of Europe. So that's sort of astonishing too. It leaves its mark on the earth, but also in us, and certainly, I think, in everybody in Australia, even though we're very good at moving on from, what's facing us. But John, did you want me to read something about that?
Yeah, you wrote a very moving section about your Zendo as the fire was approaching, and I'd really love to hear you read that, beginning on page 202 in The Great Fires.
Okay. So in the great fires of 2019 and 2020, those vast pyrocumulonimbus, this was a word that we all had to learn, pyrocumulonimbus clouds towering over our heads crackled with thunder and spat fire-created drops of rain as we made final moves to flee and take shelter with friends. Under that apocalyptic skyscape, I took a moment to attend to 2 final things. One was to lay out the zafus and zabatons in the meditation hall, which is behind me here, as if summoning the spirit of all the many people who have ever sat in this place and loved this place and taken care of it. And that was a kind of votive offering to the weather gods as they debated our fate in deciding the direction the fire winds would turn in. The other was to take a moment to seek personal counsel from the earth that mothers are, something that I'd learned to do decades before in the company of the remarkable Wiradjuri elder, Min Maya, Auntie Maureen was her name, Auntie Maureen Smith. And she taught me this: find a place that wants you to sit down on the ground. Take your time before easing your fingertips a little way into the earth. And then when you feel the connection, speak your name and out loud, saying, this is your daughter or son and your name, talking with you, Mother. And take a moment for the question that needs to be asked to arrive in your heart. Then speak it out loud and wait for the return touch, the unexpected words that sound in your own heart. My question that moment for the earth arose from sheer exhaustion and sorrow that had all but replaced several months of mounting fear. The question was, what do you need me to know about this? Her reply came in its own time with a slight buzz in my hands and a jolt to my heart. Your suffering with me is my care for you. And as I go on to say, this made a kind of unhesitating koan-like sense for me, exactly to the extent that we hold back from suffering with the earth. We stay blind to everything that's offered in my care for you. And the sense of it's all yours in the most generous sense, is subverted by the way we have lived, and we bypass the suffering that this causes. So this whole sense of mutually saving, mutually caring, is just so, it was mirror-like, it was like the two parts of that sentence are mirror-like, and you can't help but catch your own face in that mirror. In the best way.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And now you were just telling us that in the area in which you grew up, which was, I guess you call it far north Queensland, do you? The far north. There are tremendous floods in your hometown and cyclones coming in. And this is summertime, your time, exactly when you would be fearing the fires. And this is this is the earth, right? Now flooding, previously burning.
Yeah, we have to accept it is a very deeply deranged kind of weather, or climate. Climate goes beyond weather. It's the really kind of the settings we intend to rely on, this thing called climate. But we can't. No.
You grew up in that North Country near the Great Barrier Reef, and reading about your life story through several of your books, it seemed like a really wonderful, charmed sort of childhood where you ran around until you were 8 years old without shoes on, and you were swimming, in the ocean, and just such a loving family. Situation, you and your sister, and I think you had a brother, but you also had some spiritual experiences very early on when you were very young, a couple of them, and I thought I'd ask you about that. Could you share those experiences with us, and is this what sort of brought you into Zen, do you think?
I'm pretty sure it did, and I cannot recommend highly enough having a childhood with mainly bare feet, because it actually means, you're meeting the earth is meeting you in a way that's kind of fearless and direct. And it really is powerful. The earth in Australia seems to be charged with a deeply indented consciousness, and it comes up through your feet in different ways. But putting that aside, you're asking about that moment when I was about 7. I was 7, and I asked to excuse myself to go to the toilet, the bathroom, as I must call it in this American company. So I was given a note to go, and I left the class and I went down into the quite rough kind of playground that we had in Cairns, North Cairns. And I can remember hearing the 9 times table being chanted from one of the classrooms. So that was part of the moment, and so were the sort of prickles under my feet they're called sensitive weed because if you touch this particular kind of weed, it was wonderful. It all curled up and retreated from touch, like an anemone almost. So I was probably doing that a bit deliberately as well as avoiding the worst prickles in it. And I wasn't walking on the assigned path to the girls' toilet. I was walking on what apparently town planners call the pathway of desire. That's where feet really want to go. So these odd paths get tracked across grass and so on. And they wound around the back of the girls' toilet rather than up to the front. And so that's where I was walking. And somewhere along that path, everything did drop away, most profoundly, without in any way leaving me feeling afraid or bereft, or it was amazing without ceasing to be extraordinarily familiar at some level. And it was like being a kind of, I found myself to be a source of radiant light, just pouring out into some kind of vast, dark, I could say emptiness, but it was absolutely live emptiness of, it completely held what was going on. And it was like, later on if I tried to talk about it, I'd probably say it was like being a star. Because what else pours out unceasing radiance like that? That was a very joyful experience. I began to see other, you could almost call them bodies of light, floating into space, floating into sight as well. So that went on for I don't know how long, just this sense of realization. This is what, at some deep level, we are. We are this. Or at least this presents something about what we are. And I've got no doubt that a fire runs through all things, linked up with that when I saw it on the Kiyosaku, on the altar. So that was the context of that moment. I don't know how long it suspended me, John. It was timeless. There's no time in that sort of thing. But it was profoundly transforming. It just lived in my bones from then on without thinking about it much further. I do remember I had to go on and follow the call of nature, so I did that. And I went back to the classroom full of this thing. And later on, I did try to tell my mother about it. I thought I'd better try to account for this in some way. So I told her, edged up to her, the kitchen counter, and she was chopping carrots. I remember this really clearly. And she sort of stopped when I said, Mom, isn't it amazing what we are? And she said something like, yes, it is. It's wonderful that we all love each other and, we're safe and it was such a happy, I don't know what else she said, but she took it down profoundly into the relative level of love. And why not?
Yes.
But in the meantime, in a sense, I was standing there in an absolute state, meeting the relative way that could be talked about, And that was right. That felt right too. So I gave up on trying to explain it to anybody or even to talk about it. I didn't talk about it for about the next, 30 years at least. I do remember telling Jon Tarrant about it in a certain moment that seemed the only way to talk about anything at all at that point. So there it was, and it does sort of get engraved on your bones, that kind of moment, and links up with other things that happen and confirm that as you go on with looking deeply into that completely, I always want to say homely, vast space, It felt like home. It felt like home. It was home.
And then when you were 12 and you were sitting all night long, you were talking over world problems with your sibs, and you had another experience.
Actually, yes. So I have talked about that in the book. In the opening pages of the book, I think I talk about it as, I think I was 12 at that point, and I was sitting long after dinner. For some reason, my brother and sister and I sat on after dinner and just began to sort of talk about all the the intimations at that point of what was happening in the world. Like at that point, it was a lot of talk about hunger and about population explosion and the sense of, yeah, the nuclear threat was already alive in that moment, enough to be nudging us. But at every point, it was about, can we possibly be giving away or allowing to have slip away this extraordinary, beautiful state of this earth where we, and the creatures on it. I think because of where we grew up, there was in all of us, all three of us, such a natural feeling that the earth is alive, that earth is an alive reality in every single detail, not just creatures moving about, but everything in the world of change, is alive. It's alive. And the consciousness that comes out of this extraordinary physical reality is alive in consonance with the earth. That is somehow endemic for us as children, I think. My brother was 4 years older than me. My sister was 2 years older than me. So I was the youngest. This was the longest I'd ever stayed up talking. We talked our way almost into the most profound doom and gloom places. And I went to bed carrying this sort of huge new weight of feeling and thought about the world. And the sense that I'd taken some of it on, I felt slightly proud, I think. I went to sleep and I woke up next morning and made my way to that same table, our family table. And I sat down with my bowl of cereal and I put my hands on the table beside my bowl of cereal, and some kind of huge wave broke through me. I was carrying these sort of fragments of shards and sort of shattered reality inside me. But when I sat down, the wave that came through was just complete and utter. All is well. Everything is so profoundly in the right place, in some inarguable kind of way. And these two were not separable. They could not be separated. These two faces of the same moment were, it's almost as though facing into the first somehow allowed a deep, rich contact with this ground of being that is completely okay. It's blameless. It's faultless. It is just as it is in the most complete way. It's complete. And so the completeness and the brokenness somehow arrive together in perfectly able to keep company. That was the great revelation of that moment, I think. And I do also think that it was the fact that we trusted each other so deeply in that long conversation and we love each other so deeply, that allowed us to go further than you might. Yeah. To go to really tender, a very tender depth of what we're talking about. I think that community of looking is really important. I think it allowed something bigger to take place. Yeah.
And you became a spiritual seeker, and how did you find Zen?
That's such a hard question. I think I found some kind of resonance with it in Chinese poetry and Japanese poetry to a point. But I was deeply drawn to poetry. That was one way in. We did have this funny childhood thing when we set off on our bikes as children. The first person to remember to say, "I've got Buddha on my handlebars," was somehow the lucky one. So, but I have no idea where that came from. I have glad to say I have no idea where that came from. I think it was probably in my early 30s I began to realize, I guess something like a hunger. I began to recognize a hunger to, life at that point, it's not infinite. So the hunger wakes up. I need to taste this. I need to see, let it go all the way through me. I need to know where I am while I'm still here and what this is. And that's where, obviously that's where Zen opens the path. What is this? Who is this? The fundamental koan.
And you started studying session, I think, with Jon Tarrant down in Sydney. And then you became one of the first women teachers, first women Roshis in Australia, maybe 20 years ago. And I'm really interested in asking about how has Zen changed for you as a teacher in Australia over these last several decades?
Okay. Well, that's an interesting and rather long question to respond to. I said to you earlier before we came on live that I find myself to be something of an outlier, but I'm very happy in that position to be sort of connected. Probably I'm an outlier because my connection precisely with Pacific Zen is very dear to me. And so the rest of Australia is very much Diamond Sangha based. And so this both and quality is what I carry and live with and have carried through my teaching. And I guess what you could say also is that the Dharma that asks to stand up alive here where I am on this continent is it seems to me in every place where we are, it stands up and asks to be alive right where you are and in the form of the place where you are. Sometimes I've referred to the Dharma here as Red Earth Zen because it has to be particular, has to be responsive to the place where we are. Such a strong place, this continent, the oldest and most least volatile of the continents on Earth, with the oldest rocks at the surface of the Earth, anywhere on the Earth, and with the longest continuous 60,000+ millennia, of years, 60 millennia of deep time, human presence, continuing through a series of ice ages, at least one and a half ice ages, and the what do you call them? Forget the name right now. A kind of interzone that we're in at the moment. So the adjustment to climate, the deep adaptation to place over that time, it feels to me it can't be kept apart from Zen Dharma. There's a natural affinity, and it comes up through my teaching in a way that I don't know. I don't think it's very much a part of the people around me, but it's very much in my line of Zen, and the people who have become teachers through my teaching, they carry it too. And so, Red Earth Zen, it's alive.
How's my sound now? I know my sound has been much better. Okay, I turned off the original sound and I reduced the volume, so I'll speak a little louder. Well, you're socially engaged and working with the environment is very important, to you. In fact, you suggested we guard against the bloodless and socially disengaged form of Buddhism, and yet you've also said that there's no way to save the earth, which is already complete in every moment when we see it clearly. So this quality of engagement, non-engagement, of fixing something, nothing to fix. How do you teach that?
Well, Zen allows that to be easily taught, John. It is, from my point of view, it has valency in both directions at once. There's a beautiful expression from one of Shito's poems in the Blue Cliff Record, which says, "Without leaving the Buddha world, walk in the demon world." And so, at every point, Because Zen is healing opposites and into each other and resolving there is no other. No other is the fundamental realization. There's no otherness at the deepest level of our being. It's seamless. And so for there to be a sense of all things are well and so much is wrong, it just, as I talked about in that first sort of 12 years old, it made itself plain to me that these were not two. That somehow our position in the spectrum of consciousness that includes everything from the consciousness of the earth through to us, and they're not so different, is asking us to hold these as not two, to realize them as not two, to enact them as not two, to find the action. Actually, there's a beautiful expression that a great fire genius, a genius of fire, cool fire or cultural fire, Victor Stephenson, one of his old teachers once slightly muddled his words. Old professors, he called them. And in fact, they were granted honorary doctorates at one point because of their extreme, wonderful knowledge of old original fire practice. And this, of course, is fire that regenerates the earth, not fire, and it also impedes wildfire, the intensity of wildfire. So Victor was out with them, the two old teachers, and one of them said, "You've got to follow the praction." And so that's a lovely word, the praction, practice and action. You can't they flow into each other. They realize and recognize each other so completely. And what he was talking about there is quite subtle. It's subtle encounter with just down to the moisture of the leaves between your fingers before you light the fire can tell you exactly how far the fire will burn up to, where it will stop, and the fact that children will be able to safely walk on that ground within minutes. It will never be a canopy fire. It will never be destructive in the way that will, take away habitat at the canopy level and so on. And so the praction is a beautiful way of bringing together this sense of, from my point of view, the Zen practice. We talk about practice. We talk about the way of practice, and we talk about the need to respond. So practice and action. The praction. So they're not two, and they can be only encountered as not two. If we split them, we're kind of foolish on one side and ridiculous on the other. Ridiculous in terms of holding enlightenment as though it's some other state, and foolish on the side of splitting everything up, dividing up what is so profoundly, intimately undivided.
I've noticed in this book that you talk a lot more about not knowing, you say, in fact, that the not knowing mind that is needed to open up koans also opens a treasury of resources for facing the climate crisis. How are you teaching not knowing in facing the climate crisis?
I suppose what I'm trying to do in the the last chapter of the book is open up the sense of the way in which there's a great playful, imaginative, fearless, creative, very alive kind of mind that koans, in a way, because of the way that koans take you through moment after moment with very plain speech, most ordinary stage setting, no stage setting at all, in fact, just what is happening. But they oblige us, each one obliges us to resolve, not answer, but to resolve an apparent kind of, you could almost call it insult to the way we try to normally go about things, to resolve it and discover that there is a way right through the middle that is profoundly open, wide open, right through the middle of an apparent emergency or crisis, or in fact they they bring about a crisis of mind. You could even call it, they encourage a tipping point in consciousness. We talk about tipping points of climate, and this is where I tried throughout the book to bring to bring koan, mind, and crisis as how can they talk to each other? In what way can the kind of mind that becomes engraved on our bones and inscribed on our skin with deep koan practice, repeated encounters with koans, letting koan sort of, smuggle us back into reality over and over again in that way. How may that not open a way to more finely discern what is emerging in an emergency? The emergent, the new thing, the emergent, the third thing that couldn't be presumed, in a sense. You've got two opposites, now you've got a third thing that goes right through the middle. And that is something that happens again and again with koan. So, look, there's a saying about kelpies. Kelpies are Australian dogs. John's had a cross kelpie, so he knows, and he's met my various kelpies. And it's said about a kelpie that at a certain point they are ute ready. That means they are able to immediately, on command, leap up onto the back of a ute. And so I'd say that koans help us to be crisis ready. They actually kind of grow a propensity, a skill. They skill us up in a certain kind of wisdom towards a critical moment. And that can be from the most intimate, sort of small, interpersonal moment all the way through to the huge crises that we can't possibly ignore. They're reverberating through us. They're changing us. And a koan invites moving with. I love the thing that Dogen says in Advice for the Cook. He says, turn things while turning with things. I think that's a great koan for finding a path of action to be of some help in, the kind of crises we're facing. And then they're so compounded. I mean, they are obviously geophysical and involving every single human being on Earth and every other creature. And they're also geopolitical. And so they are planetary in scale. And for me anyway, to say the Dharma can sit here while these things are happening all around us is ridiculous. The Dharma, if it is to be alive in us, has to stand up to meet what's going on. So that's where I'm kind of there. Go on.
Yeah, that's wonderful. My daughter, actually, you talk about cool fire. She's become a forester, and she does prescribed burning for a large organization that owns land all around the country. She just got back from Florida, and she's been all around, and I was talking to her about people our age, and we're pretty pessimistic about the future, and quick to quote all kinds of disasters that are forecastable supposedly, and in the midst of the fires and some of the calamity that we had a year or two ago, John Tarrant said, pessimism assumes too much knowing, and I told my daughter that, and she said, yes, because they don't want to be tagged with our knowing, right? They want to develop the world and figure out what the answers are themselves, and they will. I feel like they will.
Yes, totally.
Yeah. It's come up. So I've really been struck in all of your books about how much you've tapped into Aboriginal Australian wisdom, the Paleolithic wisdom, that exists in Australia. And David Hinton, who believes that Shan Zen is not even Buddhist but Taoist, sees the strength of Chan coming from the Paleolithic, culture in China, surviving through the language, and speaks very much, as you know, about the Paleolithic culture. And I, more than anyone that I can think of, perhaps, I think that you incorporate some of the Aboriginal Australian, culture, maybe a lot of it, in your teaching. Could you do a quick reading about Uncle Max? Would that be possible?
Can I suggest reading something which I think would probably point us in the right direction to talk about that?
Okay.
And that's something that I pulled out just because it suddenly struck me this might be it has a very simple device in it for talking about the kind of mind that is what you call Paleolithic mind, I guess. Mind, in intimate, natural, not even sort of, it's an uncontroversial matter that mind and the place where you are intimates, and of intimate in a very respectful way. But just amazing, can I just read this little bit? Because it does tap into what you just said, John, about David Hinton. Yeah, and so it's unsurprising that Zen finds resonance and a strong measure of affinity with the alive field of human place, that's hyphenated, understanding formed in the unbroken 60 millennia of practice, summed up in Indigenous Australian terms as the practical and spiritual business and reality known as country. Now, country is not countryside or landscape or even bioregion, even though what are called countries in Australia often conform to bioregion from a scientific point of view. So this disarmingly simple word brings forward a profound earth etiquette, a disposition of human mind and response evolved in the single longest continuous mutual shaping on earth of human mind with highly particular habitat, one that is 60 millennia deep. It may be those earthy roots of Zen in Taoism and silence that can particularly pick up resonance with this uniquely earthed indigenous treasury of subversive wisdom and protocol, forged through dramatic epochal change. The mind more awake in seated meditation, zazen, naturally subdues itself to just what is present and arising in the field of attention. The mind awake in country naturally subdues itself to closely attending, listening, hearing, singing up, and being permeated by what country feels, wants, knows. It's almost like country begins to let us think along with it. It's mutual all the way down. Such close attention to just what is happening, just where you are, and just as you are, reclaims existence in the physical world as it reconsecrates its mystery and lets it think along with you. And then, at a certain point, consider the splayed human hand and dipped in ochre or paint and pressed against any firm surface, cave wall, church wall, rock wall, Australian rock art sites overflow with these signature greetings of the hand. And each one is a heart's claim in present tense. I am here. And even when it's 1,000,000 years old, here, and more intimately, I am, it still insists. It's here, is timeless. And you can fit your hand exactly into the palm print of someone 60,000 years ago. A perfect fit, the same no time, exactly in each hand. And it's a very human thing, there's human fingerprints there. There's the opposed thumb, which is probably the source of all the trouble on Earth. The opposable thumb, visible now even from space, its traces. So it's extended. It's actually not unlike the character for fire in Chinese, a very extended sort of radiant character. So a really interesting thinker, Tyson Yunkaporta, has suggested, consider this as the mind completely open, awake, alive, and present. And now turn your hand side on, so all the fingers are going in one direction. And now you're looking at linear, directive, even slightly coercive, persuading kind of mind, driving towards some kind of end, imagining some kind of end. It's a teleological mind. It's a mind that does not understand non-linear time, which is radiant in all directions. It's deep time is present with this particular moment in this hand. And so this sideways print shows up on no walls anywhere. It just does not. It's so much a literate kind of mind. And this is a mind of oral transmission of wisdom. And by the way, that's what Zen is. It's an oral transmission. The koan narrative encounters are oral encounters entirely. The fact that they got written down is incidental to the immediacy of oral immediate transmission. Mm. So that's where country opens up for me. It opens up with this sense of no beginning and no end. Country has these depths of, in Australian terms, of almost being the oldest and most revered ancestor. So it's kinship. You have kinship lines running through country. Country is charged with relationships. It's completely composed of relationships. It also has song lines running through it that are like arteries of spiritual force that have a teaching quality. They're like a library of knowledge about very practical things like where the best food is, but also how to preserve that best food and work your way slowly into the best food areas. Never go there first. It has all kinds of ways of protecting us from our own stupidity, but also it is embedded back in country. So the formations, the landforms, the rivers, the rocks, they hold forth this most ancient body of dreaming, as it's called, or Jukapa. Yeah. So they're force fields of every kind of knowledge coming together: physical, practical, spiritual, almost common sense, and also deep levels of initiation into greater and greater depth. The most simple looking story is not simple in the end. It goes all the way down. So
there's a koanic quality to it, right? You say that country is a richly unfolding koan that unfolds us. It's a matter resolved only in its embodiment.
And that's exactly right. I remember talking to you about that first time I met Uncle Max Harrison, who became the late Uncle Max Harrison, and sadly, because COVID snatched him from us. But I met him 25 years ago or more, and he was he just came to a conference. On the off chance, somebody invited him to do an alternative afternoon. You could go off with him and walk in country. And to walk in country means a teaching walk. To walk in country is to let country gradually form and inform you. And it's not easy. You have to, just as with a koan, you have to give away all that you think you know in order to finally truly listen to what's happening. And we walked for about 200 yards in the end for over a period of three hours. There was so much what he called teaching, poking up through the country. And it came down to things like, we're walking on a path and there's a seepage of water, just a very subtle one if you chose to notice it. And he stopped. We examined that He said, water in the land, and take it all the way down to it's a sacred site. It's a sacred site, water in the land. And it's not incidental. Nothing is incidental in country. And, a charred stick where fire's gone through and left just the charred stick, do you think that's dead? No, it's alive. And how is it alive? And so on. Now, those sound like, these teachings went on across that 25 years that I walked with him. I also, in a sense, taught alongside him in different contexts, bringing Zen to sit alongside his great initiated body of knowledge. A fully initiated man, which is a rare thing on the east coast of Australia by now. He's one of the last fully initiated men. So I felt just so privileged to know him, to walk with him so often, and to walk into country, because country lets you in by degree. You let you leave yourself at the door and walk into country. That's the respect law. You don't drag yourself importantly into it. You always ask. That's the next one. Always ask. You come in from the side. You sit and wait to be invited in. For sacred sites, or for secret sites, you don't go. But for sacred sites, there's a clapping in to let the spirits know you're there. I experienced so many astonishing things in his presence. A sense of walking into the mind of the forest and recognizing it's not this tree, that tree, it's one mind, and feeling that as a thinking process in the evidence that you could examine. It was very much an oral storytelling, teaching tradition as well for him. Everything arrived in story form. And those stories stay with you, they are a mnemonic device. You can't lose them easily.
Was that Uncle Max who held up the soil and he was talking about this fella and that fella and the separate, the warring factions?
Well, actually, yeah, he was talking about, that was on a walk with a group of people called Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation. A very slightly self-importantly well-meaning title for a group of people. But, people with very good hearts, they wanted to heal this horrible, I won't go into the detail of the gap, but everybody knows we're all living in settler countries, settler civilizations. So we know that there is a conciliation that has never taken place properly. And so we're walking in that context, and Uncle Max stopped, turned around to everybody and said, people have been talking about reconciliation. He said, I don't hold with this word reconciliation. How can you have reconciliation when there has never been a relationship in the first place? And then he did pick up a handful of earth. He held it out and said, I tell both mobs. Mob is a way of talking about white fella, black fella, particularly black fella. And that's a perfectly acceptable term in this country, black fella. He held out that handful of earth and said, I tell both mobs, reconcile with this. And I found that to be just a beautiful, sort of one of many naturally arising red earth koans, arising from this place in deep time. Mm.
And connectedness, you've written about Deborah Bird Rose called Life's Fast Playing Mutuality, the Shimmer. And she said that if you're not connected, what did she say? If you're not connected, you're not part of the earth.
Well, that was actually, you're joining two different things up. That was another Aboriginal elder who said, if you're not, she actually said, reality is connectedness. if you're not in connectedness, and that's a matter to be really deeply examined, what is it to be in connectedness? To be unopposed to the realization, the obvious, self-evident realization of connectedness in every direction. If you're not in connectedness, she said, you're not in reality. You know, you're literally absurd, not in reality. And a lot of our culture can only really be called, from looking through those eyes, can only really be called absurd at heart. I'm happy to debate that with anybody who wants to take it on.
You use a beautiful example in your book about connectedness. There's a podcast. Can you just recall that story about somebody on a podcast? Somebody asked the ecologist, "What is connectedness?" And the ecologist says, "Well, there's a moth in Madagascar that drinks
The
the
tears
tears
of
of
sleeping
bird,
birds, of
a
sleeping
sleeping bird."
birds.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
That's
If you
just
want to,
amazing.
yeah, yes.
I'd like to ask John Tarrant and Allison Atwill to jump in if they have any thoughts or any questions. I have many, many more, but I'd love to hear from them if they have some time.
Yeah, it was great. Great hearing you talk, Susan. I feel like I'm in New South Wales. It's wonderful.
See, there's an absurd thing. How could this be called New South Wales? It sort of proves the point, doesn't it? Absurdity.
Yeah, country. Yeah. And yeah, and also, the burning really affected me over here, even though, I wasn't in it, but, just sort of tore Rin Seshin, I think, and just tore my heart open with sorrow of the animals dying and the forests dying and the ancientness of the forest. So it was kind of like, old tribes, So,
Yeah.
so that was a tremendous.
And even the Gondwana land forest that you knew really well up north, that caught fire in places,
Absolutely.
Rainforest that had never seen fire.
Yeah. And I think it hasn't known fire since it was part of Antarctica,
That's right. That's right.
So tremendously sorrowful and moving for me. And also, and I felt that those forests taught me to, I didn't know what I was doing, but I know I had some indigenous friends I knew who would go out in the bush all the time. So I thought I'd do that. So I went down in the forest and sat there, and I felt like, oh, the forest taught me to meditate, and
Yeah.
getting of Zen. So I know they're burned. So there's a profound, profoundly touching, and your work also keeping the line to the indigenous people, with Zen is just really, really good. So there's that, and I think I've been thinking about how, in a certain way, in Zen, you can't have. Then there's a certain transformation happens where you leave the world you normally occupy and you go into a something that's sort of profoundly alive and you're connected to all things, and I think, I guess it happened to you when you were a little kid, but in a way, what we do with the session, with long retreats and so on, is kind of provide an engine for that, a vessel for that, I suppose, is a better term, and so I've just been very interested in how dreams touch in that, and people come to me with dreams that they're clearly in that realm, and that you can't really do Zen just by thinking about things in your head and thinking about mindfulness or whatever it is, and somehow you have to let it come over you. And so I don't know. It's just nice hearing you expressing all that, And yeah,
Well, it's probably all your fault, John, at some level.
well, we're all tangled up together, and I don't know.
There we are. I know. I'm just honoring that fact.
Yeah, Jung said something like, "We're all in the soup together," and yeah.
Yeah. And so, someone else said there's no cold spot in a boiling cauldron.
There you go. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. And I'm sort of interested in how we try to make our community a kind of cooker in that way, a container, a vessel in that way, and music and poetry and things, but also I think it's the sympathy for that kind of consciousness really seems to be an important thing. And I think that's one of the things you seem to be teaching is the openness and empathy for the native Indra and
Mm.
they were all linked.
Yeah. And you and I have talked at different times about the kind of dream quality of this midpoint of, let's call it, this sort of enjoyment body that is, it's a dreaming body in a sense. It's completely able to be at home in emptiness and the sharp limitation of the fact of we're mortal. We're only briefly here.
Why wasn't it formed earlier? And,
at every point, yeah.
right.
At every point, why wasn't I a little earlier to this moment?
Yeah, exactly. And also the sort of beauty of that's like every moment is complete and every life is complete. And so really aware of that.
The universe is complete in every moment. It's just reached its apogee right now.
Very good. I think I'll hand over to Alison with that. Thank you for your talk. Nice to be in a meditation hall again, which I think of as your wool shed, which it first was, and was just turning into a meditation hall, I think. Alison, so, yeah.
Well, I was very interested in your descriptions, Susan, of being a child and growing up without shoes on, and the feel of the earth, the mind of the natural landscape, what you were in direct contact with it, and it was speaking to you, and you were breathing it. And I think you're the only person I know that had such intimate contact with the Aboriginal culture and also with Zen. And I was thinking today, what is what in the Zen tradition, the experience of Kensho is such a central experience in one's path, and a kind of understanding where you were describing also in country, I think you called it, where there's time is no longer linear, and one feels at home for the first time entirely, I think, in one's own body and life, and there's no separation between the two. And my question to you is there a corresponding experience in the Aboriginal culture of Kensho?
That's a really interesting question, and it's not one that I ever directly sort of have ever directly probed. But it feels to me, I don't know if you, I mean, John, I don't know if you've been way out in the center where you meet that 1,000-mile gaze in Aboriginal eyes, and where there's a sense of people sitting by the roadside waiting for something, but time, like the wait just feels, the waiting and the place where they are just feel completely equal. They're equalized in some way. And I would say that that's very much running through a lot of deep experience where it hasn't been or isn't being disturbed by some of the extraordinary layers of cultural damage that have happened. But I do know, for example, that Uncle Max sometimes would come and join the meditation sit in Sydney with me. And that would be sometimes before we might be going off to do a walk in country together or something like that. But he would just come and very naturally sit. He was completely at home around Zen sessions. He would watch the walking meditation just as though it was the most natural thing on earth. That's how, you walk in country at the speed of country, which is the speed of slowed down consciousness. Finally attending to everything, hearing, feeling, hearing, listening to, sensing the conversation of country that's going on. So it's so similar. It's so adjoining. I can hardly feel it's likely that it doesn't coalesce in places. It just feels there's a natural affinity between the two, which I think is pretty obvious. It's obvious enough when you go walking in what we call the bush, forest, if you like. The forest teaches you meditation. John was making that point a minute ago. Meditation comes to you there if you're not talking, and if you're not talking, meditation just naturally arises among trees. It just does. So there's a word in a Kimberley area word in northwestern Australia called dadiri, which roughly translates as sitting quietly, not thinking, something like that. It's sort of quite prayerful consciousness, but it doesn't have any intention. It's not trying to coerce anything into happening. It's very open-handed sitting. That's how you sit when you're waiting to feel invited into country. Rather than barging in, importantly, you wait to feel the invitation. And there's another term, yoro, which is David Moljali, and also from that area, Kimberley area of northwest Australia. And he uses that word, yoro, to talk about what he calls, and I quote him in the book, he talks about going out into country, everything is standing up alive, brand new. Now, if that's not a description of waking up, what is it? Of a deeply awake state. And he says, you don't go out after things, you let them come to you. And that's so much like, again, saying, the mind that goes out to claim the 10,000 things is delusion. The mind that lets the 10,000 things advance and confirm the self, that's realization. So there's huge congruence there it's energizing. It energizes Dharma for me. Energizes my sense of what the Dharma is, obviously.
Well, it's a marvelous description. I'm just so curious about the intertwining of those experiences. And as a native to being human in some way.
Well, that's why I wanted to bring that body of experience into the book. Because I think that is a template in a sense. Country, the sense of country, is something like a template for a really intimate human-earth relationship, and it's one that is unbroken, has been, despite the centuries of damage, where we have imposed ourselves on top of what is here. Despite the broken quality of a lot of Indigenous life, this persists, country persists. It comes up in dream. In an earlier program, I actually made a radio program about the way the Sydney Basin itself, the basin in which Sydney, biggest first contact city in the country, the way that the dreaming is still making its way up. It can't be kept out of this place of now 8-9 generations of settlement contact. and it comes up in dreams, it comes back in dreams. It is alive in the place where we are. And I think that would be equally true, probably not with such a long provenance in North America of the indigenous 6,000 years on one hand, 60,000 on the other. But still, it doesn't matter. It's deep time awareness. You know, it's awareness of the time that is both absolutely flourishing right now and is indissoluble from deepest possible time. There's a lovely playful example. Maybe I notice we're going over time a bit, John, are we? Does it matter?
No, we're good. We're good. Yeah.
Okay. Because there is a sequence in a great film, if you can ever track it down, called 10 Canoes, made with the help of a white fella, but very much a black fella film. And in it, David Gulpilil, who's probably quite well known even to people in North America, I don't know, one of the finest Aboriginal actors ever. And there's a playful voiceover from David Gulpilil during this sequence in which the camera is simply up in Arnhem Land, up in far north, I guess you could say the Northern Territory of Australia. And the camera is tracking past some reasonably nondescript bushes, if you can ever find any bush to be called nondescript, because once you look at it, it's completely, here in its own right. It's perfect, it's beautiful, it's riveting. But so it's tracking past these various, people would just say, oh, that's just kind of bushy stuff. But it's tracking past it, and he starts talking. He says, now we're going back. We're going back in time now. We've gone back, and he starts to laugh. We've gone back 20 years now. We've gone back 2,000 years now. We're going back a long, long way now. We're back 40,000 years. And we're still looking at the same tracking shot. And suddenly you realize it is 60,000 years ago as well. It is. It has all of that in it. It's carrying that with it. It's co-present with this very sort of moment right now. The ease of mental travel between the time right now and the great body of time that is sort of blooming into this time right now is so natural within the mind that I want to call country, capital C for country. Country as a living presence, an alive, most venerated ancestor presence of some sort. It's like probably better to call it a mind, it is the mind indented in place. And there's so much more I could try to say about it, but I do my best in the book to say at least a skerrick of stuff about it. Yeah.
You wrote something really beautiful about dreaming and country and upside down Zen. Do you mind if I read it real quickly? It's a paragraph.
Yeah,
so
sure.
This is from Deborah Bird Rose, the anthropologist. And dreaming can be conceptualized, she says, as a great wave which follows along behind us, obliterating the debris of our existence and illuminating as a synchronous set of images those things which endure. Dreaming, you go on, like Buddha nature, is fully present in each moment and detail of ordinary time and circumstances. It's closer to breathing. The dreaming of country is sung, which means tended in ceremony, minded, to maintain the whole order of relationships that keep things whole and headed. No amount of obliteration and forgetting can take the song out of the land. It's really beautiful.
Mm. And I think I talked in that part of that book about the moment when Deborah Bird Rose was traveling with Daley Pulkara, who she would call, as an anthropologist, she would call him her teacher, not her informant. And traveling with him, they stopped for some reason because she particularly wanted to take a photo of how dramatic the countryside looked, because it had, the erosion patterns were so striking. You know, there were sort of gouges in the land torn by water, and it was visually dramatic and shocking, but also aesthetically, you know, quite demanding. She took a photo, and then she stopped and turned to him and said, "Daly, what do you call this country?" And he said, "Oh, this is just the wild. This is the wild." And now that had been quite a precious word to me, you know, to hear that, because the wild is like a sacred word almost, you know, it's the place not touched by human beings. That's how it's often held in Western culture. It's sort of like a sacred place because there's not too many human fingerprints all over it, and it's untrammeled and so on. But he called it the wild, just the wild. And she looked through those eyes and she could see, you know, this is broken country. This has been torn by too many hard animal hooves and overgrazed and stripped bare, and the water's not been able to gouge it away. So she said, "Well, what is it if it's not the wild? What is it otherwise?" And he said, "Well, what do you call it when it's not like this?" And he said, "When it's been looked after," she asked. And he said, "Oh, that's just quiet country. Quiet country." And you can hear in that a kind of, not just peacefulness, that's too inert. It's like a live kind of calm, a tended calm, tender and tended kind of relationship to country. Because by quiet country, he meant country that has been held in mind, that has been sung, venerated, has been tended with ceremony, but also in practical ways with cool fire. You know, cool fire is not quite the same as reduction burning, because it doesn't burn from the outside in, it burns from the inside radiating out. And so it cannot, you can predict exactly where it will travel to if you know the species it's burning in, and so on. That tended kind of quiet country, it suddenly makes us see just the wild is on the side of the humans. The human indifference to country that treats it as a resource rather than a source of life. And so I found that a really salutary kind of corrective to the word wild. I held it in a different light. And if you look now, there's somebody has taken huge trouble to track the places and the points of view of paintings made by quite fine artists in the 18th century in Australia and the 19th century, of land country that had not yet been heavily imprinted by white fella use and agriculture or pastoral use, and then compared that, those early almost photographs, they weren't photographs, they were paintings, of the kind of country, the way country looked. It was often called, the first people who walked in there said, this is like a vast gentleman's estate. Beautiful clumps of trees, beautiful rich grasslands with animals plentifully grazing and so on. And what he said then, what this book goes on to talk about is, now let's look at the photographs of what this country looks like now. And suddenly you see what the full force of that word wild, because it's now confused country. It hasn't, the things are growing too thickly, they're too fire prone, they're opportunistic and invasive species cropping up too readily. There's a tangle. It's a sort of a tangle rather than something that has the impress on it of care, of long, deep time care. And suddenly you see the value of the word quiet country, you know. If it's quiet enough, you can actually have a conversation with it. When it's wild, it's just a kind of jumble, a jangle, the deep conversation is lost in the noise. The signal is lost.
That's lovely. Before we end, a friend of yours, Ron Moss, is a poet and a haiku poet, and has some really beautiful poems. I just loved his poetry. Are there any that you could read to us, to share with us?
I don't have them singled out, but I can flip through the book because there's one I use them as capping phrases with his permission for each chapter. So I'll give you the final one. By the way, let me introduce you to Ron in that case, because he is a long, long time Zen student in Tasmania. So like Jon Tarrant, he was born in the only country named after Armenia. So he's very happy about that as well. And he's also a fire warden. He is a volunteer, a first responder, firefighter. He also plucks people out of the carnage of car wrecks and saves their lives. He's very quiet. He's a very fine, internationally published poet and deeply modest man. And his Dharma name, not incidentally, is Deep Fire. And so the last one that I used as a capping verse is this: unbroken horizon. A lone swimmer enters the sea. And until you drew my attention to looking again at you quoted that one in what you wrote about this talk today, Jon, and suddenly unbroken horizon steps out as a very beautiful koan itself. What is the unbroken horizon? And let me try and find another one quickly. Okay, so this is the one that corresponds to the chapter that's mainly about country and deep time and all of the things I've just been talking about most recently. And in particular, there's a series of stones up on a sacred mountain called Gulaga on the south coast of New South Wales. And it has a base stone. It's like a needle of stone pointing up into the sky. The base stone, it's in three parts: the base stone, a middle stone, and then one that disappears into nothing at the top. And that's a very deep teaching point when you're walking in country with him up there about where you're placed in time, because we're sort of in that middle stone, but all of the source stone that this is resting on is equally present, and so is the unimaginable, and in fact, don't even talk about it, the top stone. We don't inquire into that. It doesn't bear lots of talking about it. But this is the the haiku I chose from Ron's book. And it goes, it's just this: stacked in stone, the vein of time. Stacked in stone, the vein of time. That could easily be placed at the foot of that particular teaching rock or set of teaching rocks up there. Okay, another one. This comes at the end of a section that talks about the chapter called The Lotus in the Midst of Flame, and is talking very much about the impassioned kinds of states, and how is that the lotus? How does the lotus burn best inside those most powerful, difficult states of mind? So when I go for this one, I use his verse: recent argument, her spit sizzles on the clothes iron. Recent argument, her spit sizzles on the clothes iron. And if I can give you one more, I'd like to give you the one that talks most directly about fire. And this is the one that comes after the chapter actually called A Fire Runs Through All Things. And this verse is one of those single line haiku. Charred into bark, a gaze of fire. And I think a gaze of fire, there's a beautiful koan right there. You can't keep them out of haiku, it turns out. Poetry and koans, you know, who can tell them apart in the end?
Expression of this very life, right?
Yeah.
I think Jordan McConnell is on. If you are Jordan, maybe we could get some 4 vows from you. And before Jordan plays, I just want to thank you so much, Susan. I visited you down in Melbourne in May, and I was honored to be a witness to Kirk Fisher's transmission ceremony. And then I met Kynan Sutherland, who became a successor just this past spring, I think, your time. And
That's right.
I want to congratulate you on just 2 really fine teachers, just lovely, lovely people, just a lovely community down there. And as I think I told Allison or John that I came in the door of the place where you're having the ceremony, and you took my hand and you just led me around the room. I was ready to drop my hand because, okay, now after 30 seconds, you know, and you just held on to my hand and you took me for about 20 minutes around the room and introduced me to people. It was just so lovely, and I so appreciated it.
Ah, I'm glad I did that. I'd forgotten. That's great.
Well, it's just you, and it comes natural to you, right?
I hope.
Jordan,
Well,
are you there?
Before you do that, John, I'd just like to thank, in reply, I'd like to thank everybody for turning up to this and putting up with all the noise I created. And also I want to thank you, Jon Tarrant, because you are the source of a lot of the trouble. So thank you for the trouble. And thank you, Jon Joseph, because you're the source of a lot of trouble as well, it turns out.
Pleasure is mine.